Hello, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. This is my first time interacting with the Bluebird Society. I appreciate the work that you all do, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to speak to you today. Even if it is remote, I'm still glad to be part of the conference. I was asked by Darlene Sillick and Judy Simrock to be part of this conference to cover two kind of different topics. One is the ongoing invertebrate declines, especially insects, as well as some of the technologies that ornithologists use to study bird migration. So both of these have direct impacts on bird conservation and populations, but they're kind of two very different topics, so I'll cover them in that order. And I want to start by just commenting on the fact that we usually think of birds as the canaries in the coal mine. You know, we use this analogy a lot. Birds are the organism that we have the greatest amount of data on, considering how many individuals there are and how they're changing through time. And so we like to say that we can use birds to better understand what's happening to other groups of organisms. Well, fortunately, researchers are now starting to get into the world of insects and other invertebrates and gather data on declines happening there, so we can help use that information to understand what's happening to them, as well as how that impacts birds and other organisms. And this really began with kind of a widespread realization of something called the windshield effect. Basically, a lot of folks who are maybe 40 years or older have realized that their summer drives are different than they used to be in their childhood. That is, there are fewer bug splats happening on their windshields. If there's fewer insects flying around during the summer, then you're just going to simply have a cleaner windshield. Now, that's not exactly a great data set, but it's a kind of widespread realization that a lot of people had. And it turns out there is actually one group that's starting to collect data on this sort of thing. But the overall issue seems to be invertebrates seem to be declining, and can we get some better estimates of what's actually happening to them? Well, one of the best data sets actually came from Ohio. This was published just a couple of years ago, and it's based on a long-running community science project run by the Ohio lepidopterists. They have been doing lots of systematic surveys of butterflies in Ohio. And when researchers took a look at this great data set, they saw pretty major declines. So on the x-axis of this graph, you see this runs from 1997 to 2017, so a 20-year span. The y-axis is the number of butterfly individuals per minute during these surveys. And overall, the very worrying result was that the overall abundance across all butterflies surveyed in Ohio has decreased by 33% over the last 20 years. Of course, this is what surveyors are finding is the adult butterflies, but we know that butterflies go through a very important larval stage, and caterpillars are incredibly important to birds of most types. Most birds, even ones you think of as seed eaters, of course, switch to invertebrates in the summer for their own diet and to feed to their young. And so the loss of the caterpillars that would go along with that is very concerning. But what's happening beyond Ohio? Global trends are harder to come by. The best data are actually from a few places in Europe. And then there's a little bit in parts of North America, including the Ohio data set. And then as you get into the tropics and other parts of the world, there's not a lot of long-term efforts. People have started new ones, but for long-term data, there's not a lot of it. But what a lot of these bigger studies have shown is that there are declines within protected areas. So even areas that are not actively changing in terms of habitat quality are still seeing declines. And the causes of these declines really vary from place to place. For example, in Northwest Germany, there was a 70% decline across 3 decades of a general invertebrate survey. And then this global analysis looked at lots and lots of studies and put them together. And basically for 2 out of every 3 species that they looked at, there was an average 45% decline in abundance. So that says most of the world's insects are declining, and it's not by just a handful of percentage points. It's something fairly significant. We've heard a lot recently about monarch butterflies. The flyway of eastern North America, the ones we get in Ohio, are the ones that winter in Mexico. And they're certainly declining, and there doesn't seem to be a single smoking gun. In the case of the monarch butterfly, we see that a number of things, including drought conditions on the breeding grounds, decreasing number of flowers for them to nectar upon, increasing climate fluctuation in winter based on a couple of different impacts, and in things like Roundup Ready crops, and also just this loss of family-based agriculture as it switches to intense industrial agriculture on the breeding grounds. All of this seems to be having combined impacts on monarch butterflies, which is, of course, of huge concern. And that means that there's not just a single solution to this problem. They're actually, we should all be planting things like butterfly weed and milkweed, but there's lots of other bigger picture topics that we need to address just for that single species. If you look across all invertebrates in general, the causes of these declines are really varied. They're really varied. It's habitat loss and degradation. That's across all living things, it seems. Climate change is becoming more and more of an issue. In some areas, we have overall desertification with changing moisture, resource exploitation, invasive species, chemical pollution. And then we get into things that are a little bit more tied specifically to insect impacts, like nitrification from fertilizer, and then light pollution. I've done some work on how that's impacting birds, but certainly you would expect that would have an impact on insects. And then those specific insecticides, things like imidacloprid, there have been a number of them in the news. The concern is that they kill everything. They are very widespread use, and they seem to persist in the environment and flow from one habitat to another as runoff or just simple drift happens. So there's a lot of things to be concerned about for insect declines. And so the general picture is death by 1,000 cuts. This was an image from a scientific paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences based on a symposium where they brought a lot of the world's great invertebrate conservationists together to look at the causes of insect declines. And they, again, found this patchwork of many problems. No single smoking gun. It's really all of this stuff together. And I want to note that this research was done by David Wagner and some of his colleagues. The reason I bring him up is probably many of you have this excellent field guide. I think this is a really important field guide for folks to pick up, partly just to flip through it and see the sheer variety of species that occur all across eastern North America. But also, as you read through them, you see how a lot of these caterpillars are tied to just a single host plant or maybe a handful of host plants. And the diversity out there is staggering. The specificity is staggering. And then there's a lot of question marks because there's a lot that we just don't know about these species. But he is a name that if you spend some time Googling insect declines, David Wagner, you'll find a lot of additional great information out there. Well, this is a bird talk, right? So the question is, what does all of the insect declines have to do with birds? And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of birds, even species that we think of as seed eaters for most of the year, they switch over in the summer to eating insects, in part because of their abundance and in part because of the amount of protein that they deliver, which is a huge asset when they're raising young. And so we've got this bigger picture conservation problem with birds. There was a lot of attention a couple of years ago when Cornell and many partners put out a news report about 3 billion birds gone, basically 20-some% of all birds in North America disappearing since the 70s. That's not the number of species, that's the number of individual birds that have disappeared. And so their 3 Billion Birds website is worth exploring. It has a couple of rather concerning things, though. One is going back to the loss of insects. One of the major groups that's had a great decline are the aerial insectivores. So things like swallows that fly continuously and eat insects on the wing. Common nighthawk would fit in this group as well. And so that bottom left slide shows just the rather terrifying fact that about a third of the populations of aerial insectivores have been lost, including major numbers in barn swallows, but many other species. And this is generalized across migratory birds as a whole. So this is long distance and short distance migrants, and they're slightly more than 1 in 4 individuals lost out of population since the 1970s. So if you look around on their website, there are these sort of 7 simple actions to help birds. And, I can co-sign all these. I think these are all really important. I'm a big advocate of community science. I hope all of you that have cats are keeping them indoors. That is a huge number of dead birds thanks to outdoor cats. Planting native plants, I'll talk about that more. We've already mentioned pesticides and insecticides. Shade-grown coffee is that is a significant thing to learn about, and just overall reduction of plastic use. Now, these 7 actions are all what you can do, and I hope all of us can do all of these 7 things, but I think we do need to realize that this is not in and of itself enough to reverse declines. There has to be greater will at the government level. And I guess the other thing I would add to this is please vote. All right, so here's the scale of declines of eastern bluebird. These are trends based on breeding bird survey results. So these are volunteers going out every summer and counting birds in specific areas. And what you see with bluebirds is it's a total mosaic. In much of their range, they're doing well and increasing. All the colors in blue represent increases. And in areas in the sort of light brown and red are areas of decrease. So overall, it's a fairly rosy picture for eastern bluebird. But, as I say, that's not the case for all of the species out there. In fact, most birds in North America are experiencing some sort of decline. You can even look at other common birds like Carolina chickadee. You can ignore the kind of blips on the northern end of their range in Ohio. That's kind of low data. But as you look across the rest of the range, it's actually a lot of decline in Carolina chickadee. And Carolina chickadee is a bird that's been studied by folks associated with a couple of research institutions. And they focused in on one specific topic for Carolina chickadees and their declines related to insects. And that is what is going on in the breeding territory of a Carolina chickadee related to the plants. So on the left, we see the percent of non-native plants in the territory held by a chickadee. And the lower percent of non-native plants leads to higher amounts of prey. So another way to say that is, if your yard has lots of native plants, then you have plants with lots of caterpillars and spiders and other invertebrates. If you have a yard that's full of non-native plants, you might step back and say, look at what I've done. I've got these great plants with very little leaf damage and the flowers look great. But the reason that those plants are doing so well is that none of the native caterpillars and spiders and other things that are adapted to those species are present in your yard. The other way to look at that is if you don't have native plants, you're not providing food for the birds. Your bird feeder is not sufficient. You need to actually create the habitat out there. And so on the right side the result of a pretty complicated analysis. The whole point of Part B is just to see an increase as you go from left to right in the percent of non-native plants. But this all correlated to a bigger picture here, which is the number of babies fledged out of a nest declines intensively as you get into a yard or territory with very few native plants. So if you're interested in feeding birds, plant more native plants. That work was done by a student associated with Doug Tallamy. Hopefully many of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy, and Bringing Nature Home in the top left is a pretty well-read book. His newest one is on oaks. He has a lot of fantastic talks out there. I'd send you to YouTube after this talk to look up some of his great presentations. But one of the themes that will simply emerge is one of the best things you can do to feed birds is to plant oak trees. Oaks have huge numbers and diversity of caterpillars on them, and that is great food for birds. All right, so that was kind of a brief overview of what's happening in the insect and invertebrate world out there. The theme, I hope you got, was that there's lots of widespread declines in bird food. If you don't care about bugs, you can still think of them as bird food. And there's no single source that explains the declines, but there's lots of smaller impacts that you can make in your own property and beyond. So from there, I want to shift gears in a pretty major way, and we're going to go to bird technologies. Darlene had prompted me to talk about this because of some of her work with Motus towers, and I'll get into those momentarily. Basically, the way we study bird migration is heavily dependent on a lot of technologies, but some of it can be extremely simple. And I want to give an overview of just a good number of these technologies. So how do we study bird migration? Well, one of the things you can do is just get direct observation, and that means you go birding. You write down where you were and what birds you saw. Hopefully after you do that, you upload your checklist to eBird. That's a free website. You don't have to be a professional ornithologist. Everybody who looks at birds has all of the credentials they need to use this website. And I could give an entire talk just on some of the fantastic stuff coming out of eBird and their data, as well as how fun it is for keeping track of your own checklists. But the power of putting all of our birding observations together is that we can get a wide picture of each individual species. So this is 1 year in the life of all of the tree swallows of North America. The dates are ticking by at the top. You can see now it's gotten up into mid-June and we're in the breeding season. You see heavy numbers in the Great Lakes region. And then fall kicks in really in July and August, and birds start heading south and making their way to the wintering grounds. And this analysis shows things like relative abundance from place to place in North America. It also shows a slightly different timing in migration between East and West North America that's there, but it's subtle and would have been very hard to detect using other technologies. Of course, as a museum curator, I need to mention that, in addition to going birding, you can look at museum specimens. You have an object that has a known date and time to it, and you can reconstruct the routes of migration of birds from those specimens. You also can put individual markers on those birds, like bands, or the British would call those rings. And that's been really important for things like northern saw-whet owl, where we're learning a whole lot of interesting things about their spring and fall migrations. So that's direct observation, but then you can start using slightly more complicated technologies. And now we're going to track individual birds from place to place using tags that transmit. One of the technologies is satellite transmitters. These have been around for a while. These are heavier and more cumbersome. So this has scaled down to maybe thrush size by now. But when I was in graduate school, this was something that was only used in waterfowl and raptors and cranes and that sort of thing. But these are birds with transmitters on them that are speaking to satellites overhead and communicating their whereabouts. This has been covered in lots of talks. I've covered satellite tracking in detail in the past, so I'm actually going to blow past that to talk about one that people might know a little bit less about, and that is GPS, GSM. So GPS is, again, satellites. That's the Global Positioning System. And GSM is actually the communications card in some of your cell phones. So this, again, is heavy. And one of the few species that's been intensively studied using GPS GSM is snowy owls. And so the snowy owl shown on the right has a transmitter attached to its back, and the black square is actually a solar panel. So once this bird was caught and this transmitter was attached to it, the bird was released, and it was receiving a location by listening for satellite communications, but it was not sharing its location back to those satellites because that takes a whole lot of power. Instead, it puts all of its locations on each date in its memory, and then when it flies past a GSM tower or a cell tower, it then uploads its whereabouts. So these birds might go silent for days or weeks, and in some cases months, but they're still gathering data. And then when they happen to fly past another cell phone tower, they give up all of that great information. And so the fantastic thing, too, is that they're powered by solar panels, and that means that these can last years and years. And really, this, too, could be its own talk. I recommend checking out Project Snowstorm online. There's the name of it down in the bottom right. Scott Weidensaul, the writer, is one of the principal researchers with this effort. And they blog about their current results. It's just a fantastic way to spend a few hours going through their website and learning more about snowy owl migration. All right, and so the topic that Darlene had asked me really to cover was Motus, and this comes from an unexpected technology of radiotelemetry. So radiotelemetry is really for short distance coverage and tracking of individuals, and the tracking itself takes a lot of batteries. Now, this has been highly developed for tracking hunting dogs like this handsome beagle, but it's also been used in some wildlife applications. But what that means is you've seen this on nature shows where somebody's standing out in the field, they're holding a handheld antenna, they've got earbuds in, or they're listening for a ping coming from the collar on the African wild dog or from a raptor in the woods or something like that. So that's only valid over a short distance. However, researchers realized that we could tweak that system and turn it into a system to study migration. Instead of having one person walking around in the field with a handheld antenna, what if we instead put out thousands of antennas that run off of either being plugged into something or having a solar panel, and they just listen all the time for a bird to fly by, hoping that the bird has its own small radio telemetry transmitter on it. And so this system has rolled out. It's called Motus. Motus is not an acronym. Motus is Latin for movement or motility. It was created by researchers with Bird Studies Canada, and remarkably, their goal for Canada is to connect the breeding, stopover, and wintering grounds for all Canadian bird species by 2030. That is, for a black-throated blue warbler, they not only want to know where that species winters, but they want to know where does the Ontario population winter versus other provincial populations of that species. So this is very population level information, which is unprecedented. This black-throated blue warbler is actually wearing a Motus transmitter in this photo. The white spot in the center of its back is the transmitter, and you might even be able to see a thin black antenna coming from that going to the tip of the tail. This is attached to the bird using a harness. There are two elastic loops attached to the small transmitter, and depending on the kind of bird, those are either fitted over their wings, like putting on a backpack, or they're fitted over the hips. So these little transmitter devices are very lightweight. They can be, I've heard that they're actually getting lighter than 0.2 grams now. The small ones don't have great battery life, so they don't last that long, but you still can put them on ruby-throated hummingbirds now. Quite amazing. So this is the global scope of Motus. These are where the towers are located. When it first began, it was southern Ontario, and then the towers started proliferating in the east and now all across North America. There's a little bit less adoption in the rest of the world, as you can see, but that's also changing quite rapidly. So here we'll zoom in on North America, and you see kind of a hodgepodge, except there's now some pretty distinctive lines that are emerging. So you look up in British Columbia, and there's kind of a southwest to northeast line that's meant to capture any bird passing through that part of Western Canada. And then there's another one across Missouri, one on the Texas coast, the Georgia, South Carolina coast. You might notice there's even an east-west line kind of running through Tennessee into southern Missouri, and then a few more into New England. These are just sort of conceptual fences so that a bird flying north through the continent is hopefully going to be heard by one of these devices. Again, zooming into Ohio, we see that there are a good number around. There's still not as many as there are in Pennsylvania and Ontario, but that is changing. Several folks have identified a gap that's pretty clear between Sandusky Bay and Cleveland, and then again from Cleveland east to Erie, Pennsylvania. These are places where towers are needing to go, and fortunately this is happening through a new partnership that is being spearheaded by Chris Tonra at Ohio State. Chris is really, he and his graduate students have been heavily involved in Motus research for quite a while. They've had a great track record of getting funding and finding out fantastic things about bird migration. So I'm excited to see he's working with people, including local Audubon chapters, who are establishing new towers, also coordinating with Laura Kearns with the division and expanding the scope of towers throughout Ohio. And this has been a really powerful thing to have this network effect. So people have been trying to understand the migration of gray cheek and Swainson's thrushes. These two species are banded by hundreds of volunteer banders, and they're never recovered in South America. So the connectivity between their breeding and wintering grounds has just been missing based on banding data. But in one season of Motus tags, this was the picture that emerged. Motus tags were put on birds in Colombia. On gray cheeks are shown in gray. Swainson's thrushes are shown in brown. And you can see that individuals were picked up along the Texas coast, in Florida, and then again passing through the Great Lakes, and one of them even going, or a couple of them going up through the St. Lawrence Seaway. So that tells you it's not just this due north to south migration. There's actually kind of a curved migration that's taking advantage of where land is, where winds are, and other things. This is just incredible insight into bird migration. Well, so I'm a big cheerleader for Motus, and over the last few years, with support from some museum donors and Pat Lorch, formerly from Cleveland Metro Parks, we have installed 2 new towers. This one is at Kelly's Island State Park. The park manager, Chris Ashley, made this one happen using an old communications tower. We just added the tower elements on top using a bucket truck. And that Kelly's Island location has picked up a number of birds, including several common terns from the breeding grounds by Duluth. All of the ones that were picked up did the same thing. They left their breeding grounds at the west end of Lake Superior, kind of disappeared for a bit because there's not too many Motus towers between there and Lake Erie. But then once they hit Lake Erie, and you can again see all the circles where the towers are, it got picked up at Long Point and a number of other spots along Lake Erie before they headed further south. We worked to put one on top of the actual Natural History Museum roof. That one has picked up a number of interesting birds. These are the reports so far. So you see sparrows, woodcock, catbird, more terns, white-throated sparrow, and even sora. And so you can go to the website and see all of this data, motus.org. You can click on any of the tags and you get the full history of that particular tag. And so this is the sora. There was a sora that was detected as actually the transmitter was put on the bird near DC in May. A day later, it had flown essentially due west and came through Ohio, and the second ping on May 15th is actually at the Wilds. The bird then turned due north and flew over the Natural History Museum on May 23rd. And that same day, it crossed Lake Erie and was picked up in Ontario. And then it went silent for the summer, and we don't know where it nested, probably in Ontario somewhere. And then it turned around and headed south, and so far it's only been picked up by one tower. But remarkably, that was Cleveland again. The bird flew over the same tower heading south on November 2nd last year. So I keep checking that one, hoping that bird's going to pop up somewhere else so we get an even more complete story of where this sora is going. And we recently had a ping from a horned lark. This individual was tagged in Quebec in fall migration in October. And then it kind of disappeared as it headed southwest. But then once it hit that tower dense area of the Great Lakes, it was picked up near east of Rochester on November 9th. And then by November 16th, it flew over Long Point on Ontario, crossed Lake Erie, flew past the museum, and presumably headed somewhere south from there. Pretty exciting stuff. Well, so those towers cost several $1,000s, but I did want to mention that there is a technology available for anybody who is interested in trying to participate. And this is a Kickstarter. I don't make any, I don't have any benefit from this. It's just kind of a common good, and I'm very excited by this. A group based out of Cape May, New Jersey, have created a device. It's still being tested and has not shipped out yet. But this is quite amazing. That small sort of mushroom-shaped device that would sit in your yard has a microphone on it. So the microphone is picking up bird calls and sounds in your yard, and using Bluetooth, you can connect it to a speaker or just to your cell phone while you're on vacation, and you can hear what birds are in your yard in real time. So that would even be useful for listening for owls at night, or maybe you've even got flying squirrels vocalizing at night. Here at my house, I guarantee I would have raccoons being really noisy. But so that microphone part is pretty neat, but the microphone is sensitive enough and it's running at night that it's listening for nocturnal flight calls. So a lot of sparrows, warblers, and other birds give very subtle call notes as they fly at night. It's very hard for the human ear to detect them, much less to identify them to species. But using machine learning, the same technology that recognizes your faces on a Facebook photo and that sort of thing, this will have the technology to essentially report out to you the next day what birds were detected flying over your house. And then finally, in addition to the microphone, it has a tracker in there that is detecting a Motus tag in the, there's two different companies out there doing it. One of them is CTT. They're actually the ones that make Terra. But if one of their birds, like a Sora with a tracker on it, flies over your Terra, it will detect it and report that out too. So these don't fully exist yet. They're still in the, I guess they're in beta testing by now, I think. But they started on Kickstarter. Now they've jumped over to Indiegogo. It's under $200, and they're supposed to be available to us this summer. They're even kicking around having additional probes attached so you can monitor how much moisture is in your raised gardens and lots of other cool stuff. That's still in the early testing, but that's a rather exciting piece of this too. This is all that Internet of Things that you've been hearing about. All right, so let's back out. So we've talked about tracking individuals using a tag that has a transmitter in it. You can also track an individual with no transmission happening. This is a technology called geolocators. And so again, there's a little probe, a little device that's attached to this black-pole warbler. It's got a little device that's detecting, is it light outside or not? And it does that once a minute every day. And just by knowing what time the sun rose on a given day, you know how far east or west a bird is on the planet. And if you know how many minutes of daylight there are on a given day, then you know how far north or south you are on the planet. So just by tracking when did the sun rise and set for a bird on a given day, you can track its movements. But the problem is you have to catch that same bird the next year. But people have had great success doing this, and black-pole warblers, they studied them in Nome, Denali, Whitehorse, and Churchill, released the birds. The birds all migrated south in the fall through the Great Lakes region, flew nonstop over water. And in fact, from their transmissions, they know that the average over water flight was 3 days long. These birds then wintered in northern South America. The batteries died. The birds returned to Alaska and northern Canada the next summer. Researchers caught them, downloaded all the data, and were able to track this year of migration for these small little black-pole warblers. The final technology I'll mention is weather radar. This is one that maybe you have the most familiarity with. Certainly you've seen this on the evening news because this is your evening news. NexRad or Next Generation Radar generates those familiar halos of what weather is coming your way. And of course, just like Motus is distributed everywhere, for health and safety reasons, we have NexRad stations all over North America. And when there's not rain, we pick up birds. So each of these halos, these donut shapes, is thousands of birds being detected by a given radar unit. And so you see the radar unit that's somewhere between Cincinnati and Columbus. And it's got a very heavy density of birds close by. And then as you get further north towards Columbus, the density drops off because the radar beam is no longer able to detect them as well. It's getting too high in the atmosphere. This doesn't mean that there's no birds in Columbus. This means that there's not an active NexRad station there. So what's really going on in this image is that dark blue density of birds is truly covering almost all of eastern North America. And this is millions and millions and millions of birds migrating at night as detected by radar. Well, Cornell researchers took a year of NexRad data and put it all together into this fantastic animation. So we're going to track through March and into late spring. So here we're seeing ambient direction of birds as indicated by arrows, and in kind of a light blue halo representing how many birds are passing over a given NexRad station. Mid-April is when it all starts happening, folks. There's the birds coming in from coastal Texas. They're now coming in all across the Gulf of Mexico. Birds have flown 18 hours nonstop over the Gulf of Mexico. They continue spreading out all across the Great Lakes and up into western, central, and eastern Canada. Why don't we take a look at fall? Here's fall migration starting in August. August is representing some fall migration pulses already. And what I want you to notice is this general west to east pulse that is tracking each cold front that comes across North America and brings the correct winds to push the birds south. September is awesome. Again, look at the arrows of movement. Look on the Gulf Coast. Those birds are not stopping at the Gulf and going around. They are taking off out over the Gulf of Mexico to get to Central America or to the Caribbean. Even in late October, birds are still moving. And in fact, even into early November, things like American tree sparrows are on the move still. So I just love this continent-wide view of migration that weather radar is able to give us. It's a spectacular thing, and just a great reminder of the wonders of migration and also the wonders of the human mind in coming up with increasingly fantastic technologies to study this great phenomenon. With that, I want to thank folks who have funded some of the work that's been involved with Lights Out Cleveland, which is one of our migration research efforts here in Northern Ohio. And I want to say thank you to all of you for your attention and for the opportunity to talk to you today. Thanks so much.